The period many call the Age of Exploration was in reality the beginning of Europe's aggressive outward expansion. By the year 1700, this expansion was no longer a new phenomenon. It had become a harsh and established reality across vast parts of the globe, particularly in the Americas. European kingdoms, driven by an insatiable hunger for gold, silver, new trade routes to Asia and land, had stumbled upon continents already teeming with diverse civilizations. It is crucial to understand that these European powers did not discover these lands in any meaningful sense. Instead, they invaded them, initiating a period of conquest. The year 1700, therefore, marks not a gentle beginning, but a significant deepening of this global power grab, a time when the brutal patterns of colonization and exploitation were becoming firmly, tragically entrenched, setting the stage for centuries of profound suffering for millions, while generating immense wealth for a privileged few in Europe. Before 1700, figures like Christopher Columbus, sailing under the Spanish flag, and Vasco da Gama for the Portuguese crown, had undertaken voyages that reshaped the known world for Europeans. These journeys were far more than simple adventures or quests for knowledge. They represented the sharp, cutting edge of a spear aimed directly at the heart of existing, independent societies. These explorers, and the monarchs and merchants who funded them, were primarily in search of material wealth, gold, valuable spices, and human beings to convert to their particular brand of Christianity. They operated under a deeply ingrained belief in the superiority of their own God, their own culture, and their own civilization. By 1700, this arrogant conviction had served as the justification for the subjugation, displacement, and murder of millions of indigenous people. The vast oceans, which had once acted as natural barriers, were now transformed into busy highways for European ships carrying soldiers, ambitious missionaries, and profit-seeking merchants, all contributing to a grand, often violent design to remake the world primarily for Europe's benefit. By the dawn of the 18th century, a great deal of devastation had already occurred. The great indigenous empires, such as the sophisticated Aztec civilization in present-day Mexico and the sprawling Inca Empire in the Andes, had been systematically shattered by Spanish conquistadors. Their magnificent cities were ruthlessly plundered, their sacred temples desecrated, and their people enslaved or forced into brutal systems of labor. European diseases like smallpox and measles, to which indigenous populations had no prior exposure and therefore no immunity, had swept through communities with horrifying speed and lethality. Millions perished. This biological onslaught, while perhaps largely unintentional at first, acted as a devastatingly effective weapon. It weakened indigenous resistance and depopulated vast regions. Small fortified European settlements began to dot the coastlines of the Americas, serving as precarious beachheads for further relentless expansion inland, consuming land and resources with little regard for prior inhabitants. The persistent European myth of an empty wilderness was a deliberately constructed and convenient falsehood. The forces propelling this European expansion were a potent and toxic mix of greed, religious fanaticism, and nationalistic ambition. Kings and queens across Europe financed these hazardous expeditions, anticipating a massive return on their investments in the form of plundered wealth and new territories. Wealthy merchants and emerging banking houses also invested heavily, driven by the prospect of enormous profits from trade in exotic goods and, tragically, in human beings. Ordinary sailors and soldiers often signed on in the desperate hope of acquiring riches, land, or merely escaping poverty and oppression in their homelands. Religious leaders, meanwhile, saw these new lands as fertile ground for converting countless heathens to Christianity, often by force. This powerful combination proved to be an almost unstoppable force. The people already living in these targeted lands were seldom seen as fellow human beings with rights. Instead, they were viewed primarily as obstacles to European ambition, or as exploitable resources no different from the gold in the mountains or the timber in the forests. Their inherent humanity was frequently and systematically denied, a necessary psychological step to make their brutal exploitation and dispossession seem justifiable to the colonizers. By the year 1700, the major European powers had audaciously drawn arbitrary lines on their maps of the Americas, claiming immense territories that their explorers had often only glimpsed, or in some cases, never even seen. Spain asserted control over vast domains stretching from what is now Florida and the southwestern United States, down through Mexico, Central America, and a significant portion of South America. Their sprawling empire was quite literally built upon the smoking ruins and graveyards of sophisticated indigenous civilizations. Portugal, Spain's Iberian rival, claimed the enormous territory of Brazil, a land rich in timber, sugar-growing potential, and later gold. France laid claim to huge swathes of North America, encompassing much of present-day Canada and the entire Mississippi River Valley, territories they called New France and Louisiana respectively. England, a somewhat later but increasingly aggressive participant in this imperial scramble, established colonies along the eastern seaboard of North America and seized several lucrative islands in the Caribbean, always hungry for more land and more profit. These bold European claims, of course, meant absolutely nothing to the indigenous peoples who had inhabited and governed these lands for millennia. The populations within these newly established European colonies grew, albeit often slowly and fitfully, in the early years. Waves of European settlers began to arrive. Some, like the Puritans in New England, were indeed seeking a measure of religious freedom from persecution in their home countries, though they often proved intolerant of others themselves. Many more were driven by dire economic necessity, escaping crushing poverty, famine, or lack of opportunity in Europe. A significant number arrived as indentured servants, effectively temporary slaves, or as soldiers sent to protect and expand colonial interests. Small, vulnerable forts and trading posts gradually evolved into more permanent towns and settlements. These European newcomers inevitably brought with them their own distinct ways of life, their agricultural practices, their domesticated animals, and disastrously, their diseases. They pushed relentlessly inland from the coastal areas, clearing vast tracts of ancient forests for farming and displacing indigenous communities through force, fraud, or a combination of both. This colonial growth was not a peaceful, organic process. It was an invasion, a slow, creeping conquest that irrevocably transformed the American landscape and violently upended the lives of its original inhabitants. The colonial economies established in the Americas were meticulously designed for one primary purpose: to extract wealth and resources for the enrichment of the mother countries back in Europe. Agriculture in many regions quickly became dominated by the cultivation of cash crops. Tobacco in the English colony of Virginia, sugar on the French, Spanish, English and Portuguese islands of the Caribbean, and later coffee in Portuguese Brazil became immensely profitable. These valuable crops were typically grown on large plantations, vast agricultural enterprises that depended heavily and increasingly on coerced and unpaid labor. Mining was another critical source of immense wealth, particularly for the Spanish Empire. Vast quantities of silver, extracted from infamous mines like those at Potosi in modern Bolivia and Zacatecas in Mexico, flowed across the Atlantic to Spain. This influx of American silver funded European wars, built lavish palaces, and enriched royal courts and merchant elites. This immense wealth, however, was extracted at a terrible human cost, with countless indigenous people and later enslaved Africans forced to toil in treacherous, disease-ridden mines for little or no compensation, their lives callously considered expendable in the relentless pursuit of profit. Trade formed the intricate lifeblood of these burgeoning empires, a complex and often brutal web of exchange that connected continents in new and profoundly unequal ways. The most notorious component of this system was the triangular trade. European ships, laden with manufactured goods such as textiles, metal tools, firearms, and alcohol, would sail to the coasts of West Africa. There, these goods were traded for enslaved African men, women, and children who had often been captured in wars exacerbated by European demand or kidnapped from their communities. These captive human beings were then forcibly transported across the Atlantic Ocean in unimaginably horrific conditions, a journey known as the Middle Passage to the Americas. In the ports of the Americas, they were sold like livestock to the highest bidder, destined for a life of brutal, unpaid labor on plantations or in mines. The same ships would then return to Europe, their holds filled with sugar, tobacco, cotton, indigo, and other raw materials produced by this enslaved labor. This cruel and exploitative system generated enormous profits for European merchants, ship owners, and industrialists, fueling the early stages of industrial growth in Europe, all demonstrably built upon a foundation of human misery and systematic violence. For the indigenous peoples who had inhabited the Americas for countless generations, the arrival and subsequent encroachment of Europeans constituted an unparalleled catastrophe, a cataclysm that shattered their worlds. Diseases, against which they possessed no natural immunity, represented the first and arguably most devastating wave of destruction. Smallpox, measles, influenza, typhus, and other infectious illnesses, inadvertently carried by European explorers, soldiers, and settlers, swept through indigenous communities with terrifying speed and lethality. These epidemics sometimes annihilated entire villages and nations, leaving behind landscapes of death and despair. Some historical demographers estimate that as much as 90% of the pre-contact indigenous population in certain regions perished from these imported sicknesses within the first century of sustained European contact. This staggering demographic collapse, while not a deliberate act of biological warfare in most initial encounters, nonetheless crippled indigenous societies, severely weakening their capacity to resist European military conquest and economic control. Disease became a silent, invisible partner to the European sword and musket. Beyond the silent killer of disease, indigenous peoples across the Americas faced relentless, overt warfare and the systematic theft of their ancestral lands. Europeans, possessing firearms, steel weapons, armor, and horses, often held a significant military advantage in direct confrontations, though indigenous resistance was often fierce and remarkably effective for long periods. The colonizers frequently employed cynical divide-and-conquer tactics, exploiting existing rivalries between different indigenous groups and pitting them against one another to weaken overall resistance. Treaties were solemnly made with indigenous leaders, often under duress or through deliberate mistranslation, only to be routinely and callously broken by the European colonial authorities whenever more land or resources were desired for settlement or exploitation. Indigenous resistance was widespread, courageous, and prolonged in many areas, taking many forms from armed struggle to strategic retreat and cultural preservation. However, the demographic pressure from European settlement and the technological advantages of European warfare were constant and overwhelming. Indigenous peoples were systematically pushed further and further west or onto marginal, undesired lands. Their traditional hunting grounds, fertile farmlands, and sacred spiritual sites were relentlessly taken over for European farms, plantations, towns, and mines, their entire way of life systematically and often violently dismantled. When indigenous populations proved insufficient to meet the insatiable labor demands of the burgeoning colonial mines and plantations, either because they had died in such vast numbers from disease and warfare, or because they resisted enslavement too effectively, European colonizers turned their predatory gaze towards Africa. The transatlantic slave trade rapidly burgeoned into a massive, highly organized, and extraordinarily cruel commercial enterprise. Millions of African men, women, and children were captured through raids and wars often fueled by European demand for captives, torn violently from their homes, families, and cultures, and forced marched to coastal slave forts. There they were branded and imprisoned before being crammed onto specialized slave ships. The journey across the Atlantic Ocean, infamously known as the Middle Passage, was a months-long nightmare of unimaginable suffering, extreme overcrowding, rampant disease, starvation, and brutal violence. Countless individuals died during this horrific voyage. Those who survived the ordeal were then sold like chattel property in the markets of the Americas, condemned to a life of unending, unpaid forced labor, subjected to constant brutality, and systematically denied their most basic human dignity and rights. This horrific trade in human beings became a cornerstone, fueling the economic prosperity of the colonial enterprises. Slavery became deeply and inextricably woven into the very fabric of colonial life, particularly in the southern British colonies of North America, throughout the sugar-producing islands of the Caribbean, controlled by Britain, France, Spain, Portugal, and the Netherlands, and in Portuguese Brazil. Entire colonial economies, especially those based on the lucrative cultivation of crops like sugar, tobacco, rice, and later cotton, became overwhelmingly dependent on the forced, unpaid labor of enslaved Africans and their descendants. Elaborate legal structures, known as slave codes, were meticulously enacted by colonial legislatures. These laws were designed to control every conceivable aspect of an enslaved person's life, denying them any legal rights, forbidding literacy, restricting movement, and enforcing the absolute and often arbitrary power of the master. Colonial society became rigidly hierarchical, with race emerging as a primary and brutal determinant of an individual's status, freedom, and life chances. The legacy of this systematically brutal and dehumanizing system of chattel slavery would profoundly shape the social, economic, and political development of American societies for centuries to come, leaving deep, unhealed scars on the collective psyche and continuing to fuel social conflict. The British colonies established along the eastern seaboard of North America by 1700 were notably diverse in their origins and economic structures. Some, like the Massachusetts Bay Colony, were initially founded by religious dissenters, such as the Puritans, seeking to create societies based on their interpretation of biblical principles, though they often displayed little tolerance for those who differed from their views. Other colonies, most prominently Virginia and later South Carolina, were driven primarily by the pursuit of material wealth, particularly through the cultivation of tobacco and rice using enslaved labor. These British colonies developed economies based on a mix of small farming, fishing, especially in New England, shipbuilding, timber extraction, and extensive overseas trade. While some colonies developed representative assemblies, which provided a degree of self-government, almost exclusively for white property-owning men, their relations with the indigenous peoples were generally characterized by hostility, frequent and brutal wars, and a consistent pattern of broken treaties leading to land dispossession. Slavery was present and legal in all British North American colonies by 1700, but it became most deeply entrenched and economically central in the southern plantation economies, where the generation of large profits was directly dependent on the systematic exploitation of African and African-descended labor. In contrast, the French colonial empire in North America, primarily encompassing Canada, New France, and the vast Louisiana territory along the Mississippi River, developed along different lines. The French colonies generally had far fewer European settlers compared to the rapidly growing populations of the British or Spanish territories. A major focus of the French colonial economy was the lucrative fur trade. This trade, by its nature, often required the French to cultivate alliances and maintain relatively more cooperative relationships, including intermarriage, métissage, with certain indigenous groups who were essential partners in trapping and trading furs. Political control from Paris tended to be more direct and centralized than in the British colonies. The Spanish Empire, immense and initially fabulously wealthy from its silver mines in Mexico and Peru, was characterized by a highly rigid and racially stratified social hierarchy, the pervasive and powerful influence of the Catholic Church in all aspects of life, and brutal systems of forced indigenous labor, such as the encomienda and the mita. Portuguese Brazil, similarly, became heavily reliant first on indigenous, and then, overwhelmingly, on African slave labor for its immensely profitable sugar plantations, creating a society deeply marked by slavery and racial mixing. The European powers involved in colonizing the Americas were not content to peacefully coexist or share the spoils of their conquests. They were engaged in constant, often violent competition and outright warfare for control of land, valuable resources, strategic trade routes, and indigenous populations in the Americas. Spain and Portugal had initially attempted to divide the New World between themselves with the Treaty of Tordesillas, but England, France, and the Netherlands soon arrived to aggressively challenge these early claims and carve out their own empires. Wars that erupted in Europe between these rival powers frequently spilled over into their colonial territories, turning the Americas into a distant battleground. Conversely, conflicts originating in the colonies over contested land or trade could escalate and ignite larger wars back in Europe. These imperial rivalries meant that the lands and peoples of the Americas were repeatedly subjected to violence and instability. Indigenous peoples were often caught precariously in the middle of these European power struggles, sometimes strategically used as military allies by one European power against another, but almost invariably suffering the devastating consequences of these foreign disputes being fought out on their ancestral lands, using their resources. By the year 1700, the Americas had been profoundly and irrevocably transformed from the diverse mosaic of societies and environments that had existed just before Columbus's arrival in 1492. Great indigenous civilizations had been systematically shattered, their populations decimated by disease, warfare, and enslavement, their ancestral lands largely seized and reallocated for European use. Powerful European empires were now firmly established across the two continents, their economic prosperity increasingly intertwined with and dependent upon the ruthless exploitation of American natural resources and the brutal forced labor of African peoples. New, complex, and deeply unequal colonial societies were emerging, characterized by profound racial, ethnic, and class divisions that would persist for generations. The immense wealth extracted from the mines and plantations of the Americas undeniably fueled Europe's economic ascendancy and its rise to global dominance. However, this enrichment of Europe came at an almost incalculable human cost to the peoples of the Americas and Africa. The seeds of future resistance, rebellion, and revolutions, including the American, Haitian, and Latin American independence movements, were already being sown in the fertile, blood-soaked ground of this transformed and deeply wounded New World.